The late afternoon sun was sliding low over the Callahan farm, bathing the fields in molten gold. The sound of insects hummed through the air, and somewhere near the old barn, the wind chimes swayed gently. Henry Callahan, 67 years old and carrying the weather in the lines of his face, had just finished greasing the tractor. He wiped his hands on a rag, the faint scent of diesel clinging to his clothes. That's when he heard it, the deep rumble of tires on gravel, a sound that didn't belong. He turned, narrowing his eyes toward the long drive that cut through his property. A black SUV rolled up, too clean and shiny for these roads, followed closely by a white moving truck. Dust curled in their wake. Henry stood on the porch, shoulders squared, as the vehicles stopped in front of his house. The SUV's door opened, and out stepped Eric Blake, his nephew. Tall, mid-30s, wearing a sharp charcoal suit that looked out of place here. Dark sunglasses hid his eyes, but Henry didn't need to see them to know the look on his face. He had seen that smirk before, the same one Eric wore when he thought he was in control. "Uncle," Eric said, voice warm but laced with something Henry couldn't miss. "Good afternoon." Two men he didn't recognize stepped out behind him. One had the wiry build of a man used to carrying heavy things, the other carried a leather satchel that clinked when it hit his side. The white moving truck hissed as its engine idled. Henry's eyes shifted to the satchel, a locksmith's kit. "What's going on, Eric?" Henry asked, keeping his tone steady. Eric walked forward, hands casually in his pockets. "We're moving your things out. You didn't sign the papers, so I figured we'd help you get started." Henry frowned. "What papers?" "The sale contract. You know, for your own good. $750,000. City developers want this land. That's easy money for you." The words landed heavy, not because Henry hadn't heard them before, but because of the arrogance in Eric's voice, as though the decision was already made. Henry shook his head slowly. "This farm's been in our family 100 years. I'm not selling it." He let the words settle like a stone dropping into still water. Eric's smirk faltered. "Uncle, you're making this harder than it needs to be. Let's not drag this out." One of the men knelt by the front door, setting down the locksmith's bag. Metal clicked and rattled. The other man glanced at Eric, waiting for the nod to start carrying things out. Henry stepped forward, boots crunching on the porch boards, but Eric moved to block him. "You can make this easy," Eric said quietly, leaning in just enough for the movers not to hear, "or you can embarrass yourself in front of these men. Maybe go stay in a motel for a bit." Henry's jaw tightened. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. "You think you can take this place from me?" "I'm not thinking," Eric said, voice turning sharper. "I'm making it happen." Henry took a slow breath and reached into his pocket. The air seemed to still around them. He pulled out his phone, flipped it open, and began to dial. The locksmith paused, looking between the two men. Eric gave a short, humorless laugh. "Go ahead, Uncle. Call them. Tell them your own nephew is helping you move to a better place." Henry put the phone to his ear. 911, what's your emergency?" a calm female voice answered. Henry kept his eyes locked on Eric. "This is Henry Callahan. I'm at my home out on County Road 6. There are men here changing my locks without my permission. They're trying to take my property." Eric chuckled under his breath and turned toward the movers. "Keep going." Henry spoke again into the phone, his tone low but deliberate. "Tell the sheriff it's about the will." The locksmith froze, the tool in his hand hanging midair. The mover nearest the porch stopped where he was, eyes darting to Eric for direction. Eric's smirk cracked for just a moment, just enough for Henry to notice. The name of the will was like a match in dry grass, it meant something, and everyone on that porch knew it. Henry didn't give away what he knew. He didn't explain why the will was important, or how it tied to what Eric was doing. That was for later. The dispatcher's voice sharpened. "Understood, Mr. Callahan. A unit is on its way. Please stay on the line." Eric turned back to him, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This is a mistake. Henry just leaned against the porch rail, the wood warm under his hand, and looked at the horizon as if the approaching sunset was more important than Eric's words. He'd waited for this moment, not for the confrontation, but for Eric to overplay his hand. And now, Henry thought, it's happening right here, in my front yard. Somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of tires over gravel grew louder. The sound of tires on gravel grew louder, but Henry's mind was already slipping back, 3 months earlier, at the same kitchen table where his father once planned harvest seasons and winter repairs. The morning light had spilled across a spread of papers, property deeds, old tax records, and the will. The paper was thick, the kind that yellowed at the edges, and it smelled faintly of the cedar box he kept it in. His late brother, Daniel, had signed it 15 years ago, naming Henry the sole inheritor of the Callahan farm. But there was a clause, one only Henry, the lawyer, and Daniel had ever known about. If the land were sold before Henry's death, the proceeds would be split evenly between him and Daniel's son, Eric. The clause had been meant as a safety net for Eric, not a weapon against Henry. Yet, in the wrong hands, that clause could be twisted into leverage. Henry had seen the change in Eric over the years. As a boy, he'd chased chickens in the yard, laughing until he fell into the dust. As a man, he'd returned from the city in tailored jackets and Italian shoes, speaking of market opportunities and capitalizing on assets. When he first suggested selling the farm, it had been over coffee in the kitchen, just the two of them. "Uncle, you could retire. Live somewhere warm," Eric had said, stirring his coffee but never meeting Henry's eyes. "This is my somewhere warm," Henry had replied, gesturing to the sunlight streaming across the fields. "Always has been." The second time Eric brought it up, there was no warmth in his tone. He'd called it a waste to keep the land for nostalgia. Henry had ended that conversation without another word. And then the mail started going missing. First, it was small, an electric bill arriving late. Then, a bank statement that never came. Henry thought it was the post office at first, but one morning he spotted a dark blue pickup parked just beyond the tree line near the road. Inside, a man he didn't recognize sat with a coffee cup in one hand, watching the driveway. A week later, the Rayall hit came. Henry had been in the barn mending a feed trough when his phone buzzed. The bank. "Mr. Callahan, we're just calling to confirm the transfer you requested," the woman said. "What transfer?" Henry asked, setting the hammer down. "The $750,000 to a private account ending in 3817. Henry's chest went cold. "I didn't authorize any transfer. They froze the account immediately." The woman told him the request had come through with scan identification, his own driver's license, and a signature that looked almost identical to his. "Almost. Do you have any idea who might have done this?" she asked gently. Henry had looked out the barn window toward the road, where dust from passing cars hung in the air. He thought of Eric's insistence, of the clause in the will, of the man in the blue pickup. "I might," Henry had said. But he didn't tell her. Not yet. Instead, he asked the bank for something unusual, a notarized affidavit linking the transfer request to the receiving account, which was registered to Eric Blake. They sent it by courier, sealed with an official stamp. Henry slid it into the same cedar box as the will. From that day forward, Henry didn't confront Eric. He didn't warn him off. He fixed fences, mowed pastures, and let the man dig his own grave. Back in the present, the moving truck idled in Henry's driveway, the locksmith frozen by the front door, and Eric still trying to project calm. "You've been stubborn for too long," Eric said now, pacing the porch like it belonged to him. "I told you the market wouldn't wait forever." Henry said nothing, but inside, his thoughts were as precise as a chess game. Every piece had been set weeks ago. The call to 911 wasn't a cry for help, it was the trigger. The sheriff would see the will, the affidavit, and the documents Henry suspected were sitting in Eric's car right now. From the corner of his eye, Henry caught one of the movers glancing uneasily at the open locksmith bag. The man shifted his weight, as if the air here had suddenly grown heavier. Eric noticed too. "Don't stop," he snapped over his shoulder. You're getting paid to work, not stand around. The first mover bent to lift a box from the porch, but the sound of tires approaching pulled everyone's gaze to the road. A white patrol truck came into view, dust curling behind it. The SUV and moving truck seemed to shrink in its presence. Eric straightened his jacket, slipped off his sunglasses, and forced a polite smile. Perfect timing, he said under his breath. Henry didn't move from where he stood, leaning against the porch railing, the setting sun warming his back. He let the moment stretch, let Eric believe this was still his stage. Because Henry knew, before the sun dipped behind the far hill, everything was going to change. The patrol truck rolled to a stop in the driveway, gravel crunching under its tires. A moment later, the driver's door swung open and Sheriff Donnelly stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his sun-creased face calm but watchful. He wore the kind of expression that didn't need to raise its voice to command attention. Henry straightened, but didn't step forward. He wanted Donnelly to see the scene as it was: Eric on the porch, two strangers hauling boxes, the locksmith crouched by the front door with his tools, and a moving truck breathing in the late summer heat. "Afternoon, Henry," the sheriff said, scanning the yard. His eyes flicked to Eric. "Afternoon, gentlemen." "Sheriff," Eric said quickly, walking forward like a man eager to control the conversation. "We're just helping my uncle here transition to a new place. He's not been doing well on his own, so I stepped in to make sure he's comfortable." Henry's gaze didn't leave Eric's face. "Transition," he said quietly, the word tasting like rust. Eric kept talking, painting the picture he wanted Donnelly to see. "I've got movers, a locksmith, figured I'd get the heavy stuff out first so we can." Donnelly lifted a hand. "Why don't we start with some paperwork? You've got a court order? Power of attorney? Something like that?" There it was, a slight hitch in Eric's posture, a pause that didn't even last a second but was enough for Henry to see the crack in the performance. Eric smiled, too quickly. "Of course. Just, not on me at the moment." Henry pushed himself off the railing and reached into his back pocket. "I've got something you might want to see, Sheriff." From the weathered leather folder, he pulled out two documents: one, a copy of the Callahan family will, signed and notarized; the other, a formal affidavit from the bank. The sheriff took them without a word and began to read. The affidavit's language was blunt: attempted transfer of $750,000 from the account of Henry Callahan to an account registered under the name Eric Blake. Signature and ID scan provided, determined to be forged. Transaction frozen. Law enforcement notified. Donnelly's eyes lingered on the name. When he looked up, there was no warmth in his gaze for Eric. Eric shifted his weight, his voice dipping into irritation. "This is ridiculous. That's not what it looks like." "He's confused." Henry's voice was steady, but there was a quiet edge to it. "Confused? I didn't make a mistake with my own name on a bank form, Eric." The locksmith had stopped entirely now, standing with his arms crossed, watching the exchange. One of the movers set down the box he was carrying, the tension in the air pressing down like thick humidity before a storm. Donnelly tucked the documents under his arm and looked to Eric. "We're going to need to have a longer conversation about this. You got any identification on you?" Eric opened his mouth, but Henry cut in, his tone still deceptively calm. "Sheriff, you might want to check his SUV. I think you'll find more paperwork there." The sheriff's brow furrowed. "What kind of paperwork?" Henry's eyes never left Eric's. "The kind that explains why he's here today. The kind with my signature on it, except I never signed it." Eric's smirk faltered completely now. "You can't just..." But Donnelly was already walking toward the SUV. Henry's mind flashed back to the bank call, the one that had started this quiet war. He remembered the sound of the clerk's voice when she told him the account number, the one ending in 3817. He had written it down on a scrap of paper, stared at it for a long time, and felt something inside him shift. There was betrayal, yes, but there was also clarity. Eric wasn't just being pushy. He was orchestrating something. The clause in the will was just a tool. The real plan was to get the farm transferred through a quick sale, forcing Henry out, while skimming the money before anyone could stop it. Henry hadn't confronted him then because confrontation was short-term. Evidence was permanent. So he waited. He fixed the old fence near the east pasture. He painted the front porch railing. And when Eric called to check in, Henry kept the conversation polite, never hinting at what he knew. Let him think the game was his to win. The SUV's door opened with a metallic click. Donnelly leaned inside. A moment later, he emerged with a black folder tucked under his arm. He walked back slowly, his eyes scanning the contents. When he reached the porch, he looked straight at Eric. "These are property deeds, signed by you. And a redevelopment contract, also signed by you, listing this farm as transferred to a shell company. Power of attorney forms, forged. Every one of them." Eric's voice sharpened. "This is a setup. He's making this up." Donnelly didn't flinch. "Funny. The ink on these is barely dry." Henry stayed silent, watching the scene unfold like a man watching the first drops of rain hit dry soil, knowing the downpour was close. "Eric Blake," the sheriff said, his tone flat but final, "you're under arrest for attempted grand larceny, fraud, and trespassing." The movers stepped back instinctively, as though distance might save them from the weight of what was happening. The locksmith quietly packed his tools. Eric stared at Henry, his face tight with anger and disbelief. "You think you've won?" Henry's reply was almost a whisper, but it cut through the air. "I don't think, Eric. I know." The metallic click of the handcuffs was louder than it needed to be in the quiet of the countryside. Eric's wrists locked behind him, the polished steel reflecting the last rays of the sun. Sheriff Donnelly's voice was calm but carried the weight of authority. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say." "Oh, save it," Eric snapped, his voice sharp with wounded pride. "This is a joke. He's just an old man holding on to dirt. You're going to look stupid when my lawyer straightens this out." Donnelly didn't respond. He gave a small nod to one of his deputies, who had arrived moments earlier in a second patrol truck. The deputy took Eric by the arm, guiding him toward the SUV. Henry remained on the porch, arms folded, his face unreadable. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He just watched. Eric's expensive loafers crunched against the gravel, his shoulders stiff with a mixture of anger and disbelief. As Eric passed, he leaned slightly toward Henry and hissed under his breath. "You think this ends with me in cuffs? I've got friends in the city. People who want this land." Henry's reply was quiet, deliberate. "Let them want it." The movers, still standing awkwardly by the truck, exchanged glances. The taller one finally spoke. "We didn't know any of this. He just said it was his place." Henry turned his gaze on them, weighing their words. "You boys work for the company that sent you. You didn't ask questions because you didn't care to know the answers. Now you do. Get in your truck and leave." They didn't argue. The engine of the moving truck roared to life, and within moments, the white box on wheels was rumbling back down the driveway, leaving a trail of dust in its wake. The locksmith, who had been quietly packing up his tools, gave Henry a short nod. "Sorry for the trouble." Henry simply said, "Next time, ask whose door you're changing." When the patrol truck pulled away with Eric inside, the air felt different, lighter, but not entirely free. Henry knew this wasn't over. Men like Eric didn't give up easily, they pivoted, found new angles, and came back when you weren't looking. He stepped inside the house, the wood floor creaking under his boots. The living room smelled faintly of coffee and the linseed oil he'd used to polish the oak table. On that table sat an old rotary phone, black and heavy, its cords slightly frayed from years of use. Henry sat down, reached for the phone, and began to dial a number he hadn't used in years. Each click of the dial seemed to echo in the quiet room. The voice that answered was deep and slow. "McCarthy Real Estate, this is Paul." "Paul," Henry said, leaning back in his chair. "This is Henry Callahan. You're about to get a call from a developer." They'll want to confirm a property transfer. You tell them this farm's got a legal dispute hanging over it, and any sale will be tied up in court for years. There was a pause on the other end. You're sure about this? Henry's eyes moved to the window, where he could still see the faint trail of dust left by the patrol truck. I'm sure. Paul's voice took on a careful tone. Understood. Henry hung up and sat in silence for a moment. He knew the developer Eric had in mind, a slick outfit out of the city that liked to move fast, grab rural land, and flip it for housing projects. They hated risk. Even the whisper of a court battle would send them looking elsewhere. An hour later, as the light faded into twilight, Henry stood on the porch again. The sheriff's truck returned, but this time Donnelly came alone. He climbed the steps slowly, his boots heavy on the wood. Eric's booked, Donnelly said. But I need you to understand, guys like him. They've got lawyers who chew on cases like this for breakfast. It won't be quick. Henry nodded. I know. That's why I've already started making sure the people he's working with won't want him anymore. Donnelly raised an eyebrow. You're talking about the developer? Henry didn't answer directly. If they think buying this farm will drag them into court for years, they'll cut their losses. Eric's only leverage is having someone willing to buy. Without them, he's got nothing. The sheriff studied him for a moment, as if reassessing the man he'd known for decades. You're playing the long game. Henry's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. Always have. The night air was cool now, carrying the scent of hay from the fields. Henry walked to the edge of the porch, his boots settling into the worn grooves of the old boards. Out in the dark, beyond the fence line, the land stretched wide and quiet. Generations had worked the soil, men and women who'd bled into it, built their lives on it. Eric saw it as a check waiting to be cashed. Henry saw it as a promise that outlived every piece of paper with a signature. He turned back toward the house, the light from the kitchen spilling through the open door. Tomorrow, he'd drive into town, speak to his lawyer, and put the second phase of his plan in motion. But tonight, he allowed himself a small moment of stillness, knowing the first move had landed exactly as intended. Somewhere in a holding cell, Eric Blake was sitting on a cold bench, replaying the moment Henry mentioned the will. And if Henry knew his nephew at all, that thought was gnawing at him worse than the handcuffs. The next morning came with a pale, cloudless sky and the kind of stillness that made sound travel far. Henry was up before sunrise, coffee steaming in his hand as he leaned against the porch railing. In the distance, the road was empty, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way. By mid-morning, a familiar crunch of tires on gravel signaled Sheriff Donnelly's return. This time, his patrol truck was alone. He stepped out, his hat tilted low against the bright light. "Morning, Henry," Donnelly said, climbing the steps. Henry nodded. "You've been busy." The sheriff held up a black folder, thick with documents. "Found this in Eric's SUV. I didn't have time to go through it all last night. Thought you'd want to see." Henry motioned him toward the kitchen table. The sheriff spread the contents across the worn wood, property deeds, multiple copies of a power of attorney, and a redevelopment contract on glossy paper. Henry picked up the top sheet. His name was there in bold letters, followed by a signature that looked almost perfect, almost. "He's getting better at forging me," Henry muttered. Donnelly tapped the redevelopment contract. "This one's interesting. It's a transfer of the farm to a company called Pinewood Holdings. That company's set to flip it to a developer called Northfield Estates. And here's the kicker, Northfield wired a deposit into Pinewood's account 2 days ago." Henry's brow furrowed. So the wheels were already turning. "More than turning," Donnelly said. "If you hadn't called me yesterday, your land would have been in Pinewood's name by next week. And that's $750,000? It was going to disappear into 3 different accounts before you even knew it was gone." Henry sat back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him. "This is why I didn't just tell him to stay off my land. If you confront someone like Eric too early, they change their game. I needed him to think he was winning." The sheriff studied him for a moment. You've been ahead of him the whole time." Henry didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the phone. "You mind if I make a call while you're here?" He dialed the same number as last night. Paul McCarthy answered on the second ring. "Paul, it's Henry again. Listen carefully, Pinewood Holdings is fronting for Northfield Estates. They've already wired money from my farm. I want you to pass along that the transfer's tied up in fraud and will be challenged in court." Paul let out a low whistle. "That'll send them running." "That's the idea," Henry said. "Make sure they know it's not just talk. Tell them the sheriff himself has the forged documents." Donnelly raised an eyebrow but said nothing. When Henry hung up, he explained. "Developers hate one thing more than losing money: being dragged into lawsuits that can freeze a property for years. If Northfield walks, Pinewood's left holding a worthless contract." The sheriff leaned back, crossing his arms. "You know, most people in your position would just let the law take its course." Henry's eyes hardened. "Most people haven't spent their life on the same patch of earth, watching someone from their own bloodline try to take it apart piece by piece." A knock at the door interrupted them. It was one of the deputies, a younger man Henry barely knew. He handed the sheriff a folded slip of paper. "Call from the county records office. You'll want to hear this." Donnelly read it, then handed it to Henry. The message was simple: Northfield Estates has withdrawn its filing for the farm property. No further action pending. Henry allowed himself the faintest nod. The first domino had fallen. "You move fast," Donnelly said. "Sometimes speed wins." "But sometimes," Henry said, sliding the folder back toward the sheriff, "you need patience. I've been playing this hand for months." Outside, the air carried the scent of freshly cut hay. Donnelly gathered the documents and stood. "I'll take this into evidence. Eric's lawyer's going to fight like hell, but these forgeries, they're solid. He won't be able to explain them away." Henry followed him to the porch. "That's fine. Let him fight. Every day he spends on this, he's burning time and money. And every day the farm stays in my hands is a day closer to locking it down for good." Donnelly paused at the top of the steps. "Locking it down?" Henry didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted to the horizon, where the fields rolled into the distance. "I've got something in mind. But the fewer people who know the details, the better." The sheriff studied him for a moment longer, then gave a short nod and stepped off the porch. Henry stayed there, listening as the patrol truck rumbled away. The gravel settled back into silence, and he was alone again. He thought of Eric sitting in a holding cell, no idea that the developer had already walked away, no idea that the black folder in his SUV had just cut his legs out from under him. And somewhere in Henry's mind, another layer of the plan began to take shape, the one that would make sure Eric could never try this again. The black folder sat in the center of the kitchen table like an unexploded shell. Even after Sheriff Donnelly left with it, Henry could still picture every page, each forged signature, every crisp property transfer form stamped with official seals that Eric had faked. The folder wasn't just evidence. It was a map. It showed the whole route Eric had taken: Pinewood Holdings at the front, Northfield Estates waiting at the end, and the bank accounts scattered like stepping stones to move the money out of sight. Henry had lived long enough to know that money always left a trail. And trails could be followed. By early afternoon, Henry's lawyer, Michael Carter, arrived. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a no-nonsense way of speaking. As soon as Henry explained the situation, Michael shook his head. "Eric's in trouble," Michael said, flipping through the photocopies Donnelly had given them. "These forgeries? Open and shut in a criminal court. But that's not where your real fight is going to be." Henry leaned back in his chair. "Go on. Your nephew's counting on one thing: the clause in your brother's will. If the land sells, he gets half the money. That's his anchor. Even if he's convicted, a civil court could still award him that share if the farm ever changes hands." Henry's eyes narrowed. "Which means my job is to make sure it never does." Michael smiled faintly. "Exactly. Lock it down so tight that even if he lives another 50 years, he couldn't get a single acre. They talked for over an hour, strategizing. Henry didn't tell Michael everything, not yet. But he laid out enough to make the plan sound simple: keep the criminal charges alive long enough for the developer to disappear, then make a legal change to the property's future that would close the door forever. When Michael left, Henry stayed at the table, staring at the black ring left by his coffee cup. The second will was still hidden in his safe upstairs, a will Eric didn't even know existed. It named the local farmers' co-op as the sole inheritor, with a clause that voided any claim from relatives who had ever attempted to interfere with the farm's ownership. It was ironclad. And Eric had just given Henry the perfect ammunition to use it. That evening, Henry took a slow walk out to the far pasture. The fence was old here, leaning slightly where the wind had pushed against it for years. The grass swayed in the breeze, and in the distance, the silhouette of the barn stood against a sky streaked orange and pink. He remembered the day his brother Daniel had signed the first will, sitting at this same kitchen table with a pen in his hand. Daniel had been sick for months but still managed a weak smile when he said, "It stays in the family, Henry." No matter what. Henry had honored that promise for decades. But Eric had twisted family into something poisonous. A truck engine in the distance pulled him from his thoughts. He turned toward the sound and saw Sheriff Donnelly's patrol lights cresting the hill. The truck stopped near the gate, and Donnelly stepped out, the black folders still in his hand. "Thought you should know," Donnelly said, meeting Henry at the fence. "We ran Pinewood Holdings. It's a shell. No employees, no office, just a P.O. box in the city. And guess whose name is on the incorporation papers?" Henry didn't have to guess. Eric's. Donnelly nodded. "It means this isn't just fraud. It's premeditated. He built the company just to take this farm." Henry took the folder, flipping to the incorporation document. The date was 9 months ago, long before Eric ever mentioned selling the place. That detail sat heavy in Henry's chest. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment scheme. It was a long game. And now, Henry realized, that was fine. Because he'd been playing the long game too. They stood in silence for a while, the only sound the rustle of grass in the wind. Donnelly finally spoke. "The DA's going to love this. But you need to be ready, Eric's lawyer will dig into every part of your history. If you've got skeletons, now's the time to bury them." Henry allowed himself the faintest smirk. "Sheriff, the only thing I've buried on this land is my kin. And they'd all tell you the same thing: this place is worth fighting for." Donnelly gave a short nod, then climbed back into his truck. As the patrol lights disappeared into the night, Henry stayed by the fence, the folder under his arm. The wind carried the faint smell of cut hay, and in the distance, the barn owl began its slow, haunting call. Henry turned toward the farmhouse, his mind already running through the next steps. The criminal case would keep Eric busy. The collapse of the developer deal would strip away his leverage. And when the time was right, Henry would bring out the second will, making sure Eric learned, in a courtroom full of strangers, that the land he'd schemed for all his life had never truly been his to take. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee. It was a small building, the kind where everyone knew each other's business, and every whisper bounced off the paneled walls. Henry sat on the second bench from the front, hands folded, his posture calm. He'd chosen his clothes deliberately: pressed shirt, clean boots, jacket that still smelled faintly of cedar. The image of a man rooted, steady, and immovable. A deputy led Eric in from the side door, his wrists cuffed, the chain glinting in the morning light. Eric's suit was wrinkled from a night in holding, and his eyes darted toward Henry with a mixture of defiance and something else: calculation. When he was seated beside his attorney, a tall man with slicked back hair and a silver tie, Eric leaned in, speaking in low, urgent tones. The attorney nodded but didn't smile. Judge Wallace entered, his gavel striking once. "Let's keep this brief. This is an arraignment, not a trial." The charges were read: attempted grand larceny, fraud, trespassing, and possession of forged documents with intent to defraud. Each one landed like a slow hammer in the quiet room. How does the defendant plead? The judge asked. Not guilty, Your Honor, Eric's lawyer said smoothly. Henry didn't react. He knew this was only the first step in a long, grinding process. During the recess, Henry stepped out into the crisp autumn air. The leaves in the square had just begun to turn, splashes of red and gold against the courthouse's stone facade. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed a number he'd been holding off on. Callahan, came the warm voice on the other end. Evelyn, Henry said. It's time we talked about the co-op. Evelyn Price had run the local farmers' co-op for 15 years. She was sharp-eyed, quick-tongued, and had been a friend to the Callahan family since she was a teenager helping her father in the grain store. Eric's making moves again, she asked. Henry gave her the bare outline, the forged documents, the fake company, the developer already backing out. I've got a will in my safe. The co-op gets the land. No one else. But I'm waiting for the right moment to bring it out. You want the co-op ready before you spring it, Evelyn guessed. That's right, Henry said. I don't just want him to lose. I want him to watch it go somewhere he can't touch. Somewhere that'll live longer than both of us. Evelyn's voice sharpened. Then we'll be ready. I'll have the board draw up a long-term stewardship agreement. By the time you put that will on the table, the land will already have a future mapped out. Henry felt a slow satisfaction settle in his chest. Good. Let's make sure it's bulletproof. Back inside the courthouse, Eric's attorney was arguing for bail. My client is a respected businessman, he said, voice smooth as glass. He poses no flight risk. The situation is a misunderstanding, a family dispute that has spiraled out of proportion. Sheriff Donnelly, seated a row behind Henry, let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. The judge glanced at him before turning back to the attorney. This misunderstanding, Judge Wallace said, involves forged government documents, a fraudulent property transfer, in an attempt to move $750,000 into hidden accounts. Bail is set at $100,000. Eric's jaw tightened. His attorney put a hand on his arm, murmuring something that Henry couldn't hear. Henry kept his expression neutral, but inside he marked another quiet victory. Bail that high meant Eric would either have to tie up his liquid assets or start asking for help, and Henry knew just how small Eric's circle of loyal friends really was. Outside, reporters from the local paper and one city outlet were waiting. They swarmed toward Eric, but his attorney blocked most of the questions. Still, one caught Henry's ear. Mr. Blake, is it true you set up Pinewood Holdings just to take your uncle's farm? Eric didn't answer, but his silence said enough. Henry walked past the group without a word, heading for his truck. Donnelly caught up with him before he reached it. You're setting something up, the sheriff said. Henry glanced at him. And if I am? Just remember, Donnelly said, revenge feels good for a day. Justice lasts longer. Henry's gaze turned toward the distant fields visible beyond the courthouse roofs. Sometimes they're the same thing. That afternoon, Henry drove out to the co-op offices. The building was a renovated warehouse, the walls lined with shelves of seed, tools, and feed. Evelyn met him in the conference room, a folder already in her hand. This is what I was talking about, she said, sliding the folder across the table. It's a stewardship plan. Locks the land into agricultural use forever. No sale to developers, no subdivision, no exceptions. The co-op takes over management when you're gone. Henry flipped through the pages slowly, his calloused fingers smoothing each one. You're sure this will hold up in court? It's ironclad, Evelyn said. And once you name the co-op in your will, Eric's got no claim. Not now, not ever. Henry nodded, closing the folder. Then all we do now is wait. Let him fight. Let him think there's still something to win. Evelyn gave him a small, knowing smile. You're going to let him walk right into it, aren't you? Henry's eyes were steady. Every step. The next morning, fog clung low over the fields, curling in slow tendrils across the pasture. Henry stood at the edge of his porch, coffee in hand, watching the land as if memorizing every line and shadow. The farm was quiet, but he knew silence could be deceptive. Eric had always been more dangerous when you couldn't see what he was doing. The phone rang inside, its sharp tone slicing through the comm. Henry stepped in and picked it up. "Mr. Callahan?" "This is Paul," Henry said, recognizing the voice. "Just wanted you to know," Paul McCarthy from the real estate office continued, "Northfield Estates pulled out entirely. They sent a short email last night, said they don't touch properties with potential legal instability. Sounds like you got to them." Henry allowed himself the smallest breath of relief. Developers hate a fight they can't win quickly. "They'll move on." "That they will," Paul said. "But if your nephew's still got other buyers lined up." Henry's voice sharpened slightly. "He won't. Not after what's about to happen." An hour later, Henry was in town, walking through the courthouse's front doors. The smell of old paper and polished wood greeted him like a memory. The Farmers Co-op office was just down the hall. Inside, 3 members sat around a long table, coffee mugs in front of them, looking up as Henry stepped in. "Morning, Henry," said Margaret Boyd, the co-op's president. "We heard about Eric. Half the town has." Henry took a seat. "Good. Let it spread. But I'm not here to talk gossip. I'm here to make you an offer." He laid out a simple but powerful proposal. At the right time, he would transfer ownership of the farm to the co-op under a conservation lease. It would stay productive, stay in local hands, and be legally protected from outside development. And best of all, there would be a clause, one he'd already written into his secondary will, that barred any relative who had ever acted against the farm's interests from inheriting or profiting from it. Margaret leaned back, impressed. "You're planning ahead." Henry's expression was steady. "I'm making sure that once this is over, no one like Eric will ever have a claim here again. Not him, not anyone after him." That afternoon, as Henry drove back down the gravel road toward the farmhouse, he noticed fresh tire tracks near the gate, different from Donnelly's patrol truck. He slowed, scanning the fence line. Nothing moved. When he reached the porch, he saw it, a plain manila envelope tucked behind the screen door. No name, no return address. He picked it up and stepped inside before opening it. Inside were 3 printed photographs. The first, Henry's mailbox, its door hanging open. The second, a blurry shot of Henry at the feed store, taken from across the street. The third, the farmhouse at night, one light on upstairs. No note. No explanation. Henry set the photos on the table, his jaw tightening. This wasn't Eric's style, too quiet, too subtle. It was someone working for him, someone who thought intimidation might push Henry into a mistake. Instead, it did the opposite. It told Henry his pressure on Eric was working. That evening, he called Sheriff Donnelly. "Someone's been near my property, watching. Left me pictures. You think Eric's sending people out here?" "It's possible," Donnelly said. "Could be friends, could be someone he hired before his arrest. Either way, I'll have a patrol swing by more often." Henry looked out at the darkening fields. "Do that. But make it quiet. I want them to think I haven't noticed." Later that night, Henry sat at the kitchen table with the second will laid out in front of him. His pen hovered over the page, and he made a few small adjustments, tightening the inheritance clause, adding explicit language that tied it to any documented interference, no matter when it occurred. When he was done, he placed the will back in its envelope and returned it to the safe upstairs. The steel door shut with a satisfying clunk. He wasn't just defending the farm anymore, he was laying down lines in the dirt that no one would cross without paying the price. The next morning, he'd be meeting Michael Carter to finalize the legal updates. After that, all he had to do was wait for Eric's next move. And Henry knew one thing for certain, his nephew would make one. Men like Eric didn't retreat. They charged, blind, angry, and loud. And that was exactly when Henry planned to end it. The first sign of trouble came with the sound of gravel spraying against the side of Henry's house. He stepped out onto the porch, coffee mug in hand, to see a silver sedan parked crooked in his driveway. The driver's door swung open hard enough to bounce back on its hinges. Eric climbed out. He wasn't in a suit this time. Just jeans, a black jacket, and an expression twisted between fury and desperation. He still had the smooth posture of a man trying to look in control, but the quickness in his steps gave him away. "You think you're smart, old man?" Eric called out, voice carrying over the quiet yard. "You think you've won because you got me locked up for a night?" Henry didn't move from the top step. "You're out on bail. That means you should be staying away from me and this property." Eric took another step forward, hands balled into fists. "You've been poisoning people against me, developers, banks, the whole damn town. You think I don't know?" Henry's gaze was steady. "You're doing a fine job of that yourself." Eric stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, breathing hard. "You're going to sign the land over. Today. Before this gets worse." Henry's tone didn't change. "And if I don't?" Eric's lips curled. "Then maybe things happen. Maybe fences get cut. Maybe tractors catch fire. Accidents happen on old farms." For a long moment, neither man moved. The wind carried the faint smell of hay and diesel, and somewhere in the distance, a crow called out. Henry took a slow sip of coffee, then set the mug on the railing. "You done talking, or do you have more threats to make?" Eric stepped closer, his voice dropping low enough that only Henry could hear. "One way or another, this place is mine." Henry let the silence hang for a beat, then glanced toward the corner of the porch where an old trail camera sat half hidden in the vines. The red light blinked once, then stilled. 2 hours later, Henry was in Sheriff Donnelly's office. The sheriff leaned back in his chair as Henry placed a small SD card on the desk. "This from your camera?" Donnelly asked. Henry nodded. "Caught every word. You'll find the part about the fences and tractors especially interesting." Donnelly slid the card into his computer. As the audio played, Eric's voice filled the office, each threat clear, each pause just long enough to leave no room for misunderstanding. The sheriff's expression darkened. "This isn't just trespass anymore. This is intimidation, possibly even extortion. And considering you've already got active charges against him," he didn't finish the sentence, but the meaning was clear. That evening, Henry called Michael Carter. "I've got something for the case," he said, keeping his voice low. "A recording. Clear as day. Shows intent, shows malice." Michael didn't waste time with questions. "Bring it in tomorrow. We'll make it part of discovery. If his lawyer has any sense, they'll see the writing on the wall." Henry almost smiled. "His lawyer has sense. Eric doesn't." The next morning in court, Eric sat beside his attorney, looking more tense than Henry had ever seen him. The judge had already been briefed about the new evidence. "Mr. Blake," the judge said, "while this recording does not directly relate to the current fraud charges, it will be admissible should further charges be filed. I strongly advise you to remember that you are under court supervision." Eric's jaw tightened. "Understood," he said through his teeth. Henry watched him closely, not to gloat, but to measure. He could see it, the first flicker of doubt in Eric's eyes. The look of a man realizing the fight he thought he was winning had shifted entirely out of his control. Outside the courthouse, Eric caught up to him. "You set me up," Eric hissed. "You had that camera waiting." Henry's voice was calm, almost gentle. "I didn't need to set you up, Eric. You walked in here on your own." Eric's face flushed with anger, but before he could reply, Evelyn Price from the co-op approached, greeting Henry with a warm smile. She glanced briefly at Eric before turning back to Henry. "We're ready whenever you are." Henry saw the way Eric's eyes narrowed at her words, a flash of confusion, then suspicion. But Evelyn didn't explain, and Henry didn't offer it. Some truths were best revealed when they'd cut the deepest. That night, Henry sat at the kitchen table with the second will in front of him again. The recording was more than just protection, it was proof of Eric's intent to harm the farm. That made the inheritance clause in the second will airtight. In a few weeks, when the criminal trial moved forward, Henry would bring it out in court. And Eric would learn that not only had he lost his case, he'd lost the farm forever. The county courthouse was busier than Henry had ever seen it. The narrow hallway outside courtroom 2 was packed, reporters with cameras hanging from their necks, curious townsfolk whispering, and a few of the co-op members who'd slipped in quietly to support him. Inside, the room smelled faintly of varnish and paper. The judge's bench loomed at the far end, the state flag hanging beside it, its colors faded from years of sunlight through the high windows. Henry sat at the plaintiff's table beside Michael Carter, his lawyer. Across from them, Eric leaned toward his own attorney, whispering fast, his jaw tight. Michael leaned in. "Stay quiet unless I tell you otherwise. The goal today isn't to win everything, it's to make him bleed time and credibility." Henry gave a short nod. "Just tell me when to move." The judge entered, the bailiffs all rise echoing through the chamber. They all sat, the wood seats creaking. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the charges: attempted grand larceny, fraud, and trespassing, now bolstered by the newly recorded threats. When the black folder came out, Eric shifted in his seat. Michael had insisted it be presented first: the forged deeds, the fake power of attorney, the developer contract. Each document was shown on the overhead screen, the judge studying them in silence. The prosecutor gestured toward the table where the evidence Saturday. "Every one of these documents contains Mr. Blake's signature. And every one was designed to unlawfully transfer the Callahan farm into a shell company he controlled." Eric's lawyer stood. "Objection, speculative as to motive." The judge overruled him. "The documents speak for themselves." Michael stood next. "Your Honor, in addition to these forged documents, we have a recording made on Mr. Callahan's property in which Mr. Blake threatens to damage and destroy assets if his demands for the land are not met." The recording played, Eric's voice filling the courtroom. "Maybe fences get cut. Maybe tractors catch fire. Accidents happen on old farms." The words hung in the air. Eric's lawyer objected again, this time on relevance, but the judge allowed the evidence, noting its value in establishing intent and character. Henry didn't look at Eric as the recording ended. He didn't need to, he could feel the tension from across the room. During a recess, Henry stepped into the hallway. Evelyn Price was waiting, her expression somewhere between pride and anticipation. "He's crumbling," she said quietly. That recording hurt him. "And the folder, it's like you walked the jury through every step he took." Henry glanced back toward the courtroom door. "We're not done yet. There's one more piece I haven't put on the board." "You mean the will," Evelyn said. Henry's eyes hardened slightly. "Not yet. Timing's everything. If I drop it now, it looks like I'm just trying to spite him. I want it to land when he thinks there's still something to win." Evelyn's lips curved into a slow smile. "Then I hope you're ready to watch him choke on it." Back inside, Michael began cross-examining Eric. The questions were simple at first: how long he'd known about the clause in the original will, when he first contacted Pinewood Holdings, how much he stood to gain from the $750,000 sale. Eric tried to keep his voice steady, but under Michael's calm persistence, cracks began to show. "So you're saying, Mr. Blake," Michael pressed, "that you created Pinewood Holdings for legitimate business purposes?" "Yes," Eric said firmly. Michael lifted one of the incorporation documents. "And those purposes included holding exactly one property, my client's farm, correct?" Eric hesitated. "That's one way to put it." Michael let the pause hang before turning to the judge. No further questions. When the day's proceedings ended, Eric walked out of the courtroom without looking at Henry. But Henry noticed the stiffness in his nephew's shoulders, the way his hands stayed clenched at his sides. Michael gathered his files. "We've got him on the defensive now. Next hearing's in 3 weeks. That's when I want you to bring the will." Henry glanced toward the courthouse steps, where the late afternoon light spilled across the square. 3 weeks, he repeated, almost to himself. That would give him enough time for Eric to believe he could still negotiate, still maneuver. And then, when the co-op agreement was finalized and signed, the second will would be unveiled. Eric would learn, in front of the same people he'd lied to and manipulated, that even if every charge against him somehow vanished, the farm was gone from his reach forever. And Henry would watch that moment from the same place he'd watched every move of this game, steady, silent, and 3 steps ahead. 3 weeks passed like the slow tightening of a rope. The farm's routines didn't change. Henry still rose before dawn, walked the fields, and drank his coffee on the porch. But underneath the quiet, everything was moving. The co-op's board had met twice, finalizing the stewardship plan. Evelyn Price had the paperwork ready for Henry's signature. The legal language was exact. The Callahan farm would be locked into agricultural use forever, managed by the co-op, with explicit exclusion for any relative who had ever attempted to interfere with its ownership or operation. Henry had read that line 3 times the night it was drafted. It was iron. 2 days before the next hearing, Michael Carter called. "Henry," he said, "Eric's lawyer reached out. They want to talk settlement." Henry leaned back in his chair, the old wood groaning beneath him. "What kind of settlement?" "They're offering to drop their challenge to the fraud charges if you agree to sell the farm and split the proceeds according to the original will." Henry almost laughed. "He's still chasing that clause." Michael's tone was dry. "It's the only card he thinks he has left." "What did you tell them?" Henry asked. "That you'd consider it. Because the longer he believes he has a chance, the better this works in court." Henry smiled faintly. "Then let's keep him believing." The morning of the hearing, Henry arrived early. The courthouse square was quiet, the air crisp with the first bite of winter. He took the side entrance, avoiding the small knot of reporters waiting by the main doors. Inside the courtroom, Eric sat at his table in a tailored navy suit, his hair slicked back, a picture of forced composure. His lawyer leaned in, speaking quickly, but Eric's eyes were fixed on Henry as he walked in. The stare said everything. "I'm going to win." "You'll see." The proceedings began with the usual grind, updates on evidence, scheduling for the criminal trial. Then the judge opened the floor for discussions of potential resolution. Eric's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, my client wishes to resolve this matter amicably. He is prepared to forego certain claims in exchange for the sale of the property and equitable division of the proceeds, consistent with the terms of his late father's will." Michael rose slowly, adjusting his glasses. "We appreciate the gesture, Your Honor, but my client has prepared an updated estate plan that renders this offer irrelevant." Eric's head snapped toward Henry. "What estate plan?" he demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. Michael's expression was calm. "All will be explained in due course." During the recess, Eric cornered Henry in the hallway. "You think you can just rewrite everything? The will's binding." Henry's voice was steady. "The first will is binding, under certain conditions. And you met one of them the day you tried to steal this land." Eric frowned, not understanding. "Not yet." "You're bluffing." Henry didn't respond. He simply stepped past him, leaving Eric standing in the corridor, the echo of his own uncertainty louder than the murmur of the crowd. That afternoon, Henry met with Evelyn and the co-op board in a side conference room. He placed his signature on the stewardship agreement, the ink drying in deliberate strokes. The co-op's legal representative notarized it on the spot. Evelyn closed the folder with a quiet snap. "It's done. As of now, the Callahan farm is co-op land when you're gone. And thanks to the exclusion clause, Eric couldn't touch it if he lived to be 100. Henry looked around the table. "Make sure that document is ready for court tomorrow. I want it entered into the record at the exact moment he thinks he's finally cornered me." That night at the farmhouse, Henry poured himself a single glass of whiskey and sat at the kitchen table. The second will lay before him in its envelope, the same cedar scent clinging to it from the safe. He pictured the moment, the look on Eric's face when the judge read the exclusion clause aloud, the realization that every scheme, every forgery, every threat had only guaranteed his own disinheritance. This wasn't just about keeping the land. It was about making sure Eric understood that his loss wasn't an accident of the law, it was the direct result of his own choices. The next day, the courtroom would be full. The press had caught wind of a family feud with millions in land value at stake. The public wanted drama, and they would get it. But Henry knew what was coming wasn't theater. It was the endgame. The rope had been tightening for months, and tomorrow, it would snap shut. The courtroom was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled, neighbors, farmers, a handful of city reporters scribbling in notebooks. Even a few co-op members had made the trip, sitting quietly in the back. The judge's gavel brought the chatter to a halt. "We're here to address both the criminal charges against Mr. Blake and the matter of property ownership currently under dispute." Henry sat at the plaintiff's table beside Michael Carter, calm as ever. His hands rested on a thick manila envelope, the second will. Across the aisle, Eric looked confident. His lawyer had been smiling all morning, clearly believing today was their turn to shift momentum. The prosecution opened with the black folder again, forged documents, fake power of attorney, and the developer contract. Then came the recording of Eric's threats, played in the clear morning silence. Eric's lawyer tried to poke holes, suggesting the recording was taken out of context and that the property transfer documents were preliminary drafts. The judge didn't seem impressed. Then Michael stood. "Your Honor, while the criminal matter is proceeding, there remains the question of the defendant's claim to the Callahan farm under the will of his late father, Daniel Blake." Eric's lawyer perked up. "Yes, exactly. The original will stipulates." Michael held up a hand. "And that is where this becomes relevant. The original will contains a clause granting Mr. Blake a share only if the property is sold during my client's lifetime. However," he turned toward Henry, who slid the envelope across the table, "my client executed an updated will and estate plan, fully compliant with state law, naming the Callahan County Farmers Co-op as the sole inheritor of the property." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge gestured for silence. "Proceed." Michael lifted the document and began to read. "Furthermore, any relative who has attempted to interfere with the ownership or operation of the Callahan farm, whether by legal, financial, or physical means, shall be permanently barred from inheritance or profit derived from said property." He let the words hang. Eric's lawyer stood. "Objection. This is clearly retaliatory." Michael cut in, his voice cool. "It's protective. And it's binding. We have documented proof of Mr. Blake's attempts to fraudulently obtain the property, as well as threats to damage it. Under the exclusion clause, his claim is void." The judge leaned back, adjusting his glasses. "Mr. Blake, do you have any evidence to dispute this updated will's validity?" Eric's lawyer whispered urgently, but Eric just stared at Henry, his jaw tight. This isn't fair. You can't just take away my inheritance." Henry's voice was quiet but carried across the room. "You took it from yourself, Eric. I just put it in writing." The judge tapped his gavel. "The court recognizes the updated will as valid and enforceable. Any claim by Mr. Blake to the Callahan farm is hereby dismissed. The criminal charges remain pending." The room erupted, whispers, low gasps, the shuffling of papers. Evelyn Price allowed herself the faintest smile in the back row. Eric was pale now, the confidence gone. He turned to his lawyer, but the man was already packing up, his expression unreadable. Henry stood, buttoning his jacket. As he passed Eric, he paused just long enough to speak quietly. "You wanted this land so badly you built lies on top of lies to get it. But every step you took just made my case stronger. You didn't lose because of me, you lost because you couldn't see past your own greed." Eric's lips parted like he wanted to reply, but nothing came out. Outside, the autumn air was cool and clean. The courthouse steps were crowded with townsfolk and reporters. A young journalist called out, "Mr. Callahan, how does it feel to know you've won?" Henry looked past the cameras to where the fields rolled out toward the horizon. "It's not about winning. It's about keeping what matters safe. The land stays where it belongs." Evelyn stepped up beside him. The co-op's ready when you are. We'll keep your promise. Henry nodded. That's all I wanted. That evening, he sat on his porch as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in deep gold and orange. The sound of crickets rose from the grass, and somewhere near the barn, the wind chimes swayed in the breeze. The farm was quiet again, not the kind of quiet before trouble, but the kind that comes when the fight is over. Henry knew there would be more work ahead. Land always needed tending, fences always needed mending. But now, no matter what happened, the farm would never fall into the wrong hands. Eric could fight his criminal charges for years, but when it came to the farm, his battle was over. The field stayed.